It began on a night when the palace lights should have symbolized calm stability, yet, instead, they flickered like warning signs across ancient stone. Behind those walls, a confrontation none of the public was ever meant to know erupted without mercy. A single message had reached Prince William, one that forced him to act before dawn. Because Andrew, against every rule, every warning, every silent agreement, was preparing to walk straight into a ceremony designed for only the most trusted souls in the monarchy. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. And from the moment William read those words, the familiar calm he relied on collapsed inward, replaced by a pressure that tightened around his chest like an unspoken ultimatum. He knew what this ceremony represented, not in the public-facing sense of tradition and formality, but in the way the monarchy internally measured loyalty, authority, and the quiet, shifting power that held the institution together. Andrew's presence would not simply cause discomfort. It would split the palace into factions, each one carrying their own whispers and grievances, each ready to twist the moment into something far more dangerous. William could already sense the thin cracks forming beneath the surface as old tensions stirred, and the weight of what might come if he failed pressed deeper than he expected. The alert had been brief, almost suspiciously concise, as if someone wanted him to know just enough to panic, but not enough to understand the full picture. That alone unsettled him, because if someone wanted Andrew inside that ceremony, they were defying the king's private decrees and the carefully constructed boundaries meant to protect the crown from further humiliation. It meant someone inside the palace, a figure with proximity, influence, or leverage, had chosen chaos over stability. William's mind raced through possibilities as he moved through dim corridors, each step echoing like a countdown to a disaster he was desperately trying to prevent. He thought of the ceremony's purpose, the fragile alliances it depended on, and the heightened scrutiny that already surrounded the monarchy. If Andrew walked into that room, every inch of progress they had fought for, every negotiation, every carefully measured decision would disintegrate in an instant. Worse, the credibility of the institution would fracture in ways that could never be fully repaired. William could feel that truth tightening around him, reminding him that leadership sometimes required stepping into darkness before the light had a chance to emerge. Yet beneath the urgency, another sensation lingered. Suspicion. Andrew would not attempt something this bold without encouragement. Someone had whispered to him, someone had emboldened him, someone had given him the illusion of permission. That was the part William could not ignore. Because it meant tonight, it wasn't simply a moment of recklessness, it was the beginning of something orchestrated. And as the tension swelled around him, he understood with chilling clarity that what he did next would shape the palace's future in ways no one was prepared to admit. But to understand why William had no choice but to intervene, we must go back to the moment the ceremony was conceived and the dangerous royal forces that saw Andrew's presence as their opportunity. Long before Andrew attempted his forbidden return, a ritual older than Windsor's walls had been quietly revived, one never acknowledged publicly, yet whispered about in corridors where portraits watched in silence. This ceremony wasn't ceremonial at all. It was strategic, symbolic, and razor-sharp in consequence. Only a chosen few were approved to attend, each selected to shape the monarchy's future, and that is what made Andrew's attempt not merely disruptive, but dangerous. What William understood, perhaps more deeply than anyone else, was that this gathering represented more than tradition. It was the initiation into the Crown Council, a body that exerted influence in ways the public never glimpsed, shaping decisions long before they reached the king's desk. It carried the kind of authority that determined who truly guided the monarchy from within, and this time, attendance was restricted to the king, William, Anne, and a few trusted figures known as the Guardians of Transition. Every seat was symbolic, every voice weighed, and every presence mattered. Andrew, however, had been intentionally and explicitly barred, not out of cruelty but out of necessity. His past controversies had fractured trust, and the monarchy's internal structure could not risk another rupture. Yet Andrew saw the invitation list not as protection but as rejection, a deliberate attempt to exile him from the remaining fragments of influence he believed he still deserved. And worse, he wasn't alone in that interpretation. Some, within the palace, viewed the ceremony as a dangerous consolidation of power around William and Anne, believing their growing influence would leave little room for alternative voices. To these quiet dissenters, Andrew's return represented an opportunity, an unpredictable but potentially useful tool to disrupt the tightening circle around the crown. Their whispers reached him slowly, wrapped in suggestions and veiled encouragements, stirring embers he thought had long gone cold. Andrew convinced himself that he wasn't intruding. He was reclaiming a place stolen from him, stepping into a room where he believed his presence would force acknowledgement, if not acceptance. This was the root of the storm now brewing around the palace, because while the ceremony was built on precision, secrecy, and unity, Andrew's intentions were built on emotion, grievance, and the lingering belief that he still belonged to a version of the monarchy that no longer existed. William sensed the shift as soon as he learned about the attempted intrusion, recognizing that Andrew's actions were not spontaneous. They were the result of weeks of quiet fueling, hidden motivations, and calculated manipulation. And beneath all of this was the unmistakable truth that Andrew's attendance would fracture the ceremony entirely, turning a moment meant to secure the monarchy's future into a spectacle of internal division. William understood that this wasn't just about stopping Andrew. It was about preventing the monarchy from tearing itself apart at the very moment it was trying to rebuild. Yet Andrew's determination didn't develop overnight. It was fueled by weeks of secret conversations, quiet promises, and a brewing storm no one saw clearly until it was too late. For months, Andrew had moved like a shadow, never drawing attention, never making noise, yet steadily closing in on something he believed was rightfully his. Advisors dismissed him, the public forgot him, but Andrew had not forgotten himself. Every quiet lunch, every discreet call, every long car ride toward unseen destinations carried one goal: to slip back into the power structure that once protected him. What began as quiet frustration soon hardened into something sharper, something driven by a sense of betrayal he could no longer suppress. He felt abandoned by the very institution he had once served, sidelined as though his name no longer held weight. And the sting of exclusion pushed him into a relentless search for relevance. That desperation fueled a hidden campaign, one built not on public statements but on whispered conversations with old allies, figures who still believed he had a role to play, who insisted the monarchy had mishandled his downfall, and who fanned the hope that a dramatic return was possible. These allies didn't offer direct promises, but their sympathy carried a dangerous undertone, reminding him of the influence he once wielded and suggesting there were still cracks inside, the palace walls through which he could slip. Then came the message, short, vague, but powerful enough to ignite the ambition he had been trying to bury. Someone from inside the palace had reached out, someone with enough proximity to the ceremony to know it was being held behind tightly closed doors. The note didn't explicitly invite him, yet it didn't deny him either, leaving just enough ambiguity for Andrew to seize as confirmation that his time had come again. He clung to it, convinced it was the signal he had been waiting for, the sign that certain individuals within the institution wanted him back in the room, even if others didn't. The emotional conflict swirling inside him deepened. Resentment toward those who pushed him aside, desperation to reclaim his relevance, and nostalgia for the days when his voice carried weight in the palace he still considered home. These emotions merged into a potent drive that made him believe this return wasn't a risk, it was destiny. But underneath that determination was something even more unsettling. Andrew wasn't merely planning to attend the ceremony. He was preparing to challenge the balance of power it was meant to reinforce. He saw an opportunity to undermine William's tightening circle and disrupt Anne's growing authority, imagining himself as the unpredictable force that could tilt the internal equilibrium back toward a version of the monarchy that had room for him. That belief, inflated by months of secrecy and subtle manipulations, convinced him he wasn't intruding, but reclaiming what he had been unfairly denied. What Andrew didn't realize was that his movements, once invisible, had begun generating a faint but unmistakable disturbance within the palace. A shift in tone, a change in behavior, a ripple of unease that reached the very person he hoped to outmaneuver. But while Andrew prepared his silent comeback, William had begun noticing unsettling patterns, shifts in tone, whispers in hallways, and a rising tension that pointed to one truth Andrew never expected. Prince William wasn't meant to hear it. The phone call was supposed to go unnoticed. The whisper exchanged between two senior aides meant to vanish into the air. Yet in a palace where secrets echo louder than shouts, nothing stays hidden for long. When William caught the thread of Andrew's plan, it didn't just alarm him, it forced him to re-evaluate who inside the palace was truly loyal. The moment the words reached him, a chill swept through his thoughts, not because Andrew wished to appear at the ceremony, but because someone had clearly helped him believe he could. That realization struck harder than the news itself, revealing a fracture deep within the palace hierarchy that William had sensed but never fully understood. He replayed the moment in his mind, the tone of the aides, the reluctance in their voices, the way silence followed their exchange. An uneasy silence that confirmed this wasn't a misunderstanding or rumor, but the early formation of a plan designed to unfold behind his back. As the truth became undeniable, his concern sharpened into urgency, because Andrew's presence wouldn't simply disrupt the ceremony, it would undermine its legitimacy entirely, dismantling the careful structure the King, Anne, and William had built to keep the monarchy stable during a precarious transition. The real danger wasn't Andrew's determination, but the quiet unrest simmering beneath the surface, an undercurrent that had been building slowly among senior courtiers who felt sidelined by the ceremony's exclusivity. William sensed that this was their moment, their attempt to push back against the authority, consolidating around the next generation of leadership. And Andrew, eager, wounded, and desperate, was the perfect instrument for their rebellion. That awareness made every hallway conversation feel tainted, every passing glance weighted with suspicion. Still, William knew he couldn't confront this alone. The stakes were too high, and the lines between ally and adversary too blurred to navigate without support. So he turned to the person who had always seen through palace illusions with razor-sharp clarity, Princess Anne. Her reaction was immediate, a flash of controlled anger beneath the calm exterior she maintained for the sake of continuity. She recognized the threat instantly, not just to the ceremony, but to the monarchy's internal equilibrium. And her decision to stand with William wasn't merely strategic. It was protective, the instinct of someone who had witnessed too many internal collapses begin with whispers and end with catastrophe. Their shared understanding formed a silent pact. The ceremony would not be compromised, and Andrew would not be allowed to walk into a moment designed for unity and turn it into a battlefield. Yet the deeper William looked, the clearer it became that this situation could not be resolved with warnings or subtle interventions. Someone had given Andrew the confidence to reappear at the most sensitive moment in recent royal history, and that someone was still inside the palace, watching, waiting, and hoping William would fail to act quickly enough. That knowledge hardened his resolve, pushing him toward an inevitable confrontation he had hoped to avoid. Because if Andrew believed he was entitled to return, and if others subtly reinforced that belief, William knew he could no longer treat this as a misunderstanding or an error in judgment. It had evolved into a direct challenge to the monarchy's order, a challenge he would have to face before it spiraled into something far more destructive. But before William could act, the king himself issued a directive that pushed the situation from tense to explosive. While William raced to understand the depth of Andrew's intentions, King Charles had already made his judgment. In a private, wordless moment, marked only by a nod to his most trusted aide, the king delivered an order that would tilt the battlefield. It was a command rooted not in anger, but in fear of what Andrew's presence could unleash inside a monarchy already stretched thin. And that silence, that single, decisive gesture, carried more weight than any speech Charles could have offered, because it revealed just how deeply the situation had shaken him. The king had been briefed in fragments, mentions of Andrew attempting to return, signals that someone inside the palace had emboldened him, whispers that the ceremony meant to unify the monarchy might instead fracture it wide open. Every detail only intensified the anxiety gripping him, reminding him that one misstep could erase months of careful stability. The thought of another scandal bleeding into public view was more than Charles could withstand. The monarchy was already fighting to protect its image, already juggling scrutiny, already walking a tightrope between tradition and modern expectations. Andrew had become a symbol of everything the institution wanted to move beyond. His sudden determination to reappear at a sacred internal gathering threatened to drag them backward into chaos, and Charles knew the consequences would be immediate, loud, and unforgiving. That was why his directive to William came with such heavy finality. Handle it quietly, but decisively. No public scenes, no staff involvement, no opportunity for rumours to escape the palace walls. Charles wanted the problem erased before it even surfaced a clean removal, an internal correction that would allow the ceremony to proceed without shadows creeping over it. But beneath that order was something far more human: exhaustion. Charles had carried the burden of leadership through turbulence after turbulence, and the strain of constant crisis had etched itself into the way he spoke, the way he paused before giving instructions, the hesitation that clung to his usually steady demeanour. He wasn't merely concerned about the monarchy, he was painfully aware of his own limits. Another confrontation, another internal betrayal, another jolt to the system he didn't have the strength to endure all of it at once. That truth wasn't spoken, but William felt it. He recognized the emotional weight behind his father's instructions, the quiet plea wrapped inside the authority. Charles needed him not as a son, not even as an heir, but as the stabilizer of a monarchy wobbling under pressure. With that unspoken responsibility, the entire burden shifted onto William's shoulders. He was now the one expected to contain the crisis, to protect the ceremony, to prevent Andrew from igniting a firestorm that would spread far beyond palace gates. And in that moment, William understood that the internal chain of command had fully activated. Every senior figure knew their role, every decision now funneled through him, and every potential weakness demanded immediate reinforcement. About preserving the monarchy's core, at a moment when any misstep could unravel the fragile progress they had made. And with the king's order echoing through his thoughts, William felt the full gravity of what he had to confront next, the one person who refused to accept the limits that had been set for him. And so William, carrying the weight of the crown itself, prepared for a confrontation that would unfold in the darkest corner of the palace. The palace was nearly silent when William arrived, just the hum of distant lights and the low creak of an ancient corridor. Andrew was already inside, standing where no one expected him to be, dressed as though nothing had changed, but everything had changed. And as the clock pushed past midnight, the heir to the throne stepped forward to stop a man who believed he still had the right to stand among kings. The tension between them was immediate, heavy with years of unspoken conflict, and William wasted no time in addressing the moment that had been spiraling toward him all night. He confronted Andrew directly, his words sharp with urgency but steadied by the weight of responsibility, demanding to know why he was there and who had given him the impression he was welcome. Andrew answered with the same stubborn confidence that had propelled his return, insisting he had every right to attend the ceremony, as though his past had no bearing on the present, as though the rules applied to everyone but him. That declaration only deepened the strain. William warned him that stepping into the ceremony would not revive his influence. It would destroy what little stability the monarchy still had. He laid out the consequences, the political fallout, the inevitable backlash, the way Andrew's presence would overshadow everything the ceremony was meant to symbolize. But Andrew refused to accept any of it, his frustration spilling into accusations that had long been simmering deep inside him. He claimed William had been trying to erase to him, to push him out of the family's inner circle, to bury him beneath layers of shame and silence. He argued that the monarchy had betrayed him first, that he had been condemned without mercy while others enjoyed protection, and that William's intervention tonight was simply another attempt to diminish him. Their exchange grew harsher, edging toward the wounds they had both tried to avoid, exposing resentment that had festered through years of distance, scandal, and shifting loyalties. William, however, refused to be pulled into Andrew's emotional storm. He reminded him that this wasn't about personal history or old grudges. It was about the monarchy's survival. about the responsibilities tied to the crown, about the damage that would ripple outward if Andrew forced his way into a moment that was never meant for him. The argument reached its breaking point when William delivered the command he knew Andrew would hate but could not challenge. Andrew would not attend the ceremony. Not now, not ever. Not while the future of the monarchy depended on decisions made behind those guarded doors. The words struck with finality, leaving Andrew staring back at him with a mixture of disbelief, humiliation, and rage. Yet powerless to counter the authority now standing before him. For a moment, nothing moved. Then Andrew stepped back, not in agreement, but in recognition that William's resolve was immovable. Their confrontation had ended, but the damage it carved between them was unmistakable. A fracture that would not heal easily and might never heal at all. William left knowing he had prevented a disaster, but also sensing that this midnight encounter had set new tensions into motion, tensions he could no longer ignore or contain. Yet even as Andrew backed down, the fallout of this confrontation had already started rippling outward. By morning, the palace felt different, not calmer, but colder. Staff avoided eye contact, courtiers whispered cautiously, and the sense of a storm that had just passed lingered like heavy fog. William's intervention had prevented disaster, but it had also exposed fractures hidden deep in the walls of the monarchy. And now, everyone wanted to know. Who helped Andrew, and why? The tension in the air was unmistakable. A quiet unease that pressed against every doorway and tightened around every conversation. Rumors moved faster than truth, twisting through corridors and offices until even those who had no involvement sensed that something monumental had taken place in the night. Some whispered that an argument had broken out. Others speculated that Andrew had attempted a dramatic return. Yet no one knew the full story, only that William had been at the center of it, and that whatever happened had left the palace's fragile unity shaken. William felt the weight of those whispers, but he had no time to address them. His mind was fixed on uncovering who had encouraged Andrew, because Andrew's confidence didn't come from imagination. Someone inside the palace had lit the fuse, pushing him toward the ceremony at the most volatile moment possible. William began retracing the clues he had overheard, the tone of certain aides, the shifting expressions on faces that usually revealed nothing, the sudden evasiveness from individuals who rarely hid their intentions. It became clear that alliances were shifting quietly, that some courtiers had started positioning themselves for influence in the shadows. Their subtle movements spoke volumes. They sensed instability, and instability always attracted ambition. What troubled William most was how quickly loyalties seemed to blur when power appeared up for negotiation. King Charles, still carrying the strain of constant crisis, summoned William for a private moment. His words were soft but weighted, a quiet acknowledgement of the son who had stepped into chaos to protect the crown. He praised William for preventing a catastrophe, but his reassurance came with a warning that the palace was full of tensions he no longer fully understood, and that bigger threats were forming beneath the surface. Charles knew that Andrew's attempted return was not an isolated act. It was the symptom of something deeper, something far more corrosive, and he feared that the monarchy's stability was beginning to hinge on a handful of decisions made behind closed doors. Princess Anne, sharper and more perceptive than anyone, approached William with her own determination. She saw through the palace's outward calm immediately, recognizing that someone inside their circle had chosen disloyalty, and she vowed to uncover exactly who had dared to manipulate Andrew for their own agenda. Her resolve carried an intensity William relied on, because she understood the inner workings of the monarchy in ways few ever could. Together, they sensed that the previous night's confrontation was merely the opening act of a larger, hidden war brewing beneath the surface, one driven not by loyalty but by quiet ambition and resentment. The palace's atmosphere continued to shift as the morning unfolded, with whispers tightening into suspicions and suspicions curdling into fear. It wasn't just Andrew's attempted return that unsettled the institution. It was the realization that someone had used him as a tool. William understood that the real danger wasn't Andrew himself, but the hands that had guided him toward the ceremony. The fractures in the monarchy weren't simply emotional. They were strategic, calculated, and quietly expanding. And as William prepared to face the ceremony without Andrew, he felt the unsettling truth settling deeper. This was no longer a crisis to be contained, but a conspiracy waiting to be exposed. And those deeper forces would reveal themselves as the ceremony finally began without Andrew, but not without chaos. As the palace doors opened and the chosen few took their places, every eye watched for disruptions that never came, but the tension was unmistakable. This was supposed to be a moment of unity, a declaration of the monarchy's next chapter. Instead, it became an event overshadowed by the absence of one man, a reminder that silence can sometimes be louder than scandal. The ceremony began with a solemn weight that hung over the room like an unspoken warning. Those who understood the gravity of the moment were painfully aware of how close the institution had come to implosion during the night. And while the proceedings unfolded with the precision expected of the Crown Council, the emotional undercurrent was impossible to ignore. Every nod, every exchange of glances, every carefully chosen phrase carried the residue of uncertainty Andrew had left behind. William tried to steady himself, but the echoes of the confrontation still clung to him. His mind kept drifting back to the intensity of Andrew's defiance, the sting of accusations, the way the situation had nearly spiraled out of control. He forced himself to focus, knowing that today wasn't merely ceremonial, it was a turning point for the monarchy's internal hierarchy. But clarity was difficult when his thoughts replayed the night in fragments, reminding him of the dangerous alliances forming in the palace shadows. Nearby, Anne's sharp instincts remained on full display. Her eyes moved with deliberate precision, quietly scanning every corner of the room, searching for signs of dissent from those who had dared to orchestrate Andrew's attempted return. She knew that betrayal rarely ended with one failed scheme, and William could feel her silent vigilance reinforcing the fragile line between order and chaos. King Charles sat with a dignity that carried both strength and strain. His posture was resolute, but the exhaustion beneath it was undeniable. He had endured too many crises in too short a time, and though he held the ceremony together with practiced composure, it was clear that the events of the past hours had taken a toll. He watched the proceedings with an intensity sharpened by fear that if anything went wrong today, the monarchy might not withstand another blow. The Crown Council's formalities progressed with a gravity that elevated the stakes far beyond tradition. Every ritual felt like a statement, every articulation of duty like a demand for the monarchy to survive just a little longer, to hold its ground against pressures that threatened to consume it from the outside and from within. Those in attendance sensed they were witnessing more than a customary gathering. They were standing inside a moment shaped by conflict, secrecy, and the shifting foundations of royal power. And then came the final symbolic gesture, simple in appearance, but monumental in meaning. William was handed a document, a ceremonial acknowledgement of authority within the council's inner workings, marking his role not just as the heir to the throne, but as the stabilizing force the institution now depended on. It was more than tradition. It was recognition. It was responsibility. It was also a message to those who doubted him that despite the turmoil, despite the attempted sabotage, despite the shadow Andrew had cast over the institution, William was emerging stronger, more aware, and far more determined to protect the crown from further fractures. Yet, even as he accepted the gesture, a sense of unease flickered through him. Something felt unfinished, as though the ceremony was only the surface of a deeper shift he had not yet fully grasped. But the ceremony's closing moment would unlock the story's final twist, one that changes everything. William believed he understood. Just when William thought the danger had passed, a sealed envelope arrived, delivered by someone he never expected, containing a truth he never wanted. Inside it lay the reason Andrew had been so confident, so determined, so certain that he belonged at the ceremony. It was a revelation that didn't just reopen old wounds, it exposed a secret that threatened to upend the monarchy's future. The moment William broke the seal, he felt a shift in the air around him, as though the palace itself was bracing for the truth he was about to uncover. What he found inside wasn't speculation, rumor, or fragmented whispers. It was proof cold, undeniable evidence that someone within the palace, someone with access and authority, had orchestrated Andrew's attempted return with deliberate precision. Names, messages, timelines, and closely guarded correspondence merged into a chilling picture. Andrew had not acted alone, nor had he misread signals. He had been guided. The betrayal came from a high-ranking official William had trusted for years, someone who had always appeared loyal, steady, and aligned with the monarchy's future. But the evidence made the truth impossible to ignore. This official had promised Andrew a pathway back into relevance, assuring him that support existed inside the palace, that the ceremony was his rightful moment to reclaim a place he believed had been unfairly taken. In exchange, Andrew had been asked for something just as deceptive. Loyalty. Not loyalty to the crown, or to the king, or to William, but loyalty to a faction determined to reshape the monarchy from the shadows. The official's intentions were laid bare in the letters: undermine William's growing authority, weaken Anne's stabilizing influence, and disrupt the Crown Council's carefully constructed balance. Andrew had been a pawn, a tool for disruption, used by someone who wanted to fracture the power structure and rebuild it to their own advantage. The realization hit William with a force he hadn't anticipated. Every step he had taken that night, every decision he had made to protect the ceremony, every warning he had issued to Andrew, it had all been part of a larger, hidden battle, one that was only now revealing its true scale. And beneath his anger was something far heavier: sorrow, because this wasn't a threat from outside the monarchy. It was one that had grown within its walls, disguised as loyalty until the moment betrayal served its purpose. The emotional weight pressed down on him, forcing him to confront the painful truth that protecting the crown meant questioning even those he trusted most. He felt the divide between family and duty widening, reminding him that the monarchy's survival sometimes demanded sacrifices no one could prepare for. But the envelope offered more than answers. It delivered a warning. The conspiracy Andrew believed he was stepping into was only one layer of a deeper movement, a network of ambition that stretched further than William had imagined. What he had uncovered tonight wasn't the end of the crisis. It was the beginning of a far more complex struggle, one that would test not only his leadership but the stability of the monarchy itself. And as he closed the envelope, he felt the weight of that truth settle like a shadow. Across the future he was being forced to defend. And as William closed the envelope, the truth echoed louder than ever. The monarchy had survived the night, but the real battle was just beginning. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe.